Hi everyone, welcome to GCAP 2021. This is narrative design software and workflow, raising the bar for narrative game development. Let's dive right into it. So, who am I? My name is Mel Taylor. I'm a narrative game designer in Brisbane and director of Mellow Games, which is a studio that I founded about 3 years ago after moving from Germany to Australia. I'm the co-creator of Orwell, which is an interface-based data spying thriller game. And I am currently developing Blueberry, which is a narrative platformer that takes players on a journey through a woman's mind from birth to death. I am also a product designer at Articy, which is a bit of a disclaimer now because obviously not entirely unbiased because of that. I've been working as a freelancer for Articy for 3 weeks now, and when I started working on this talk, I didn't work at Articy yet, but the inspiration kind of came from applying for this job and then sort of thinking about, okay, what kind of tools have I worked with in narrative design so far, and what tools are out there compared to that. So yeah, also keep in mind that everything I'm saying is from a narrative designer's perspective. I'm not a programmer, and I'm sure there are also pros and cons related to the software that are more related to whatever the programmer has to do or what implementation convenience tools you have. So I won't talk about that so much. And I also, for the games that I've worked on with the software that I have been working on for a few years now, I'm going to be able to say a bit more about that and the convenience of working with it or inconveniences. That's just the nature of doing this talk. So just keep that in mind. This is the overview. So first of all, I'm going to ask the question, what is the Photoshop of narrative design? Then we're going to go into the game logic versus creative writing question before starting on the actual tools, which is first of all PlayMaker, then Celtx Game VR, then Ink by Inky, then Articy Draft, and lastly we have Yarn Spinner. And after that, I will also mention a few tools that I have been looking at that have come up during my research that I find interesting and still worth trying out, depending on what you want to do. It's just that there are so many tools out there for this, and as you might have guessed, there is not necessarily the one tool that everyone uses and agrees on this being the industry standard. So yeah, what is the Photoshop of narrative design? I asked on Twitter a while ago narrative designers and writers, which tools do you use? What kind of writing style do you have? Do you prefer using a text editor like more linear workflow, or do you use flowcharts? And what are the pros and cons for you? Plus, are there any features for tools that you are missing completely that, yeah, you would like to have? And a surprisingly high number of people were saying, okay, I just use Word and a piece of paper, and that works for me. And I think this is a legitimate answer if you're in the concept phase of a project, and yeah, like depending on what exactly you want to do with your game, depending on how much text you actually have as content in the game, and depending on how narrative heavy your game is, you are going to want to look at different solutions. So my conclusion for this initial question is the Photoshop of narrative design is sticky notes and Google Docs. And so I am also no exception. This is how I started working on the game logic for Blueberry. This is the basic concept. This is how we worked on Orwell at the beginning. Same thing, it's a corkboard board with notes on it in nice colors. And then we have the Blueberry game design document. So like I work with both. And this is all of the content, the game logic, the mechanics description, plus the writing itself. So yeah, what is the basic problem? So on the one hand, with narrative design, we have arranging the game logic, the story modules, the branching points of the story, and we're thinking on a meta level of the game, basically. And with writing, we have actual game content. And perhaps we're writing dialogues, we're writing documents, we're writing item descriptions, and these things are two different tasks. So for me, the ideal tool would be something that can combine these two things. But depending on which tool you use, if you have something that is node-based, that is like a flowchart tool, it's going to be a bit more difficult for creative writing. And a text editor is just a more comfortable way of having a lot of writing content. And then on the other hand, the problem with text editors is that you won't have great oversight over your game logic. So in some cases where you have branching dialogue, you might have to copy paste and repeat the content if there are nodes that share this content. So just to illustrate this idea, this is a super basic flowchart narrative design concept. You have an inciting incident, then you have something good happens or something bad happens. These are the choices, and then you have a resolution. Now this is a bad way to do it, just for the record, on a creative note, because you have a player choice, but you have the same outcome. So your players are going to be really pissed off if you do it that way. Don't do it, but you get what I mean. Now we fill these nodes with the writing content. So here we have, hi GCAP folks, is what I'm saying to you. Then we have your answer, hi Mel, great talk. Or you have, hi Mel, crappy talk. This would be your player choice. And then the outcome for both of these choices is applause, because Australians are super polite. Yeah, and here you see the same idea with the same content in a linear writing form, just to illustrate what I mean by this. And as you can see, the nodes that are shared in the previous flowchart have to be repeated here if I just write this down in a linear way. So this is not a great way necessarily to do it. So let's dive into the tools. First off is PlayMaker. PlayMaker is a pretty proven tool. It has been around for a few years. Inside was developed using PlayMaker. Hollow Knight also used PlayMaker. So that's really great. We are currently using PlayMaker on Blueberry, and it is basically a Unity plugin. So you can use it directly in Unity. You can attach it to an object, and then you have the state machine which is attached to this object. In this scene for Blueberry, we have a word fight going on. So Blueberry just came home from a party, and depending on your choices, she's drunk. And then Mom comes home, Blueberry wakes up from the couch, and Mom starts fussing at her. And now we have a fight going on. And the goal of the player is, so you see those little bars underneath the characters. These are called the blues bars. And it's kind of like an inverted health bar, so you want to keep it as low as possible. And the first character that reaches 100% blues loses the game. So the player's goal is to get Mom's blues bar to 100% before your own blues bar gets to 100%, using hurtful language, basically. Here we have the state machine in PlayMaker that I created for this scene. Basically, the cool thing is you can press play in the engine, test it in Unity, go through the game and test it, and you can at the same time see where the state machine is at in the PlayMaker window. This is inside one of the nodes. So as you can see here, each of these nodes that are called states in PlayMaker have different actions. So all of these actions can happen in this one state. So we have, for example, the actual dialogue in this state is "where the hell were you?" And then we have things like "add blues to target." This is, does this dialogue line add blues to whichever character and how much? So I'm able to do all these things in PlayMaker. And another cool thing is that you can create your customized actions. So basically how we did it is I asked my programmer, David, who's super great to work with, can you create an action for me so that I can use it in PlayMaker? And he goes, sure. And then I describe the action that I want to use, and he writes the script for this action for me. So you can customize this depending on what you want to do in your game, and then you can use it freely. So that's very cool because I have complete freedom over what happens in the scene, and I can iterate on it without annoying my programmer. This is an example of a global variable that you can create in PlayMaker. So we basically have the word fight be interrupted depending on who hits maximum blues first. So this is also a customized variable that determines how high is the blues, or rather it asks, is the blues at 100%? If yes, the next state machine is triggered. And then we have a final state of the scene. So either player wins or mom wins, and different endings depending on which of these two happen. So for PlayMaker, I would say a great pro is the state machine, where you can integrate the writing directly into the nodes, which also has its downsides though. But I am able to work fully and directly inside Unity without having to import anything, and I can iterate directly on it without annoying my team members. And then we have the customizable actions that you can create, the debugging mode in PlayMaker, which throws errors depending on which state you are in. And we have a very fair price of 65 US dollars on the asset store, which is around 90 Australian dollars. The cons are you cannot really write in a linear way like in a text editor. It's definitely not as comfortable if you have long form text to use. Then you need some programming knowledge in order to create your customized actions, or you need a programmer on your team who does that for you. There is, as far as I know, there's no search and replace function. So what you have to do is go inside each node. So let's say, hypothetically, I misspell the word mom, or I use the English spelling instead of the American spelling for it, and I want to change that. I have to go into each node and change it there. Or long term, what we would probably do is export this text to an Excel sheet, and that's also how we would do the localization, and then import it back into PlayMaker and let an editor work on this. But inside PlayMaker, you can't really do this. Okay, next up. So we have Celtx Games in VR here. This company originally developed screenwriting tools for the film industry. And so the goal for Celtx, for the basic tool, is to organize film projects, like film production as well, but also obviously the screenwriting content. And then they decided to also make a version for games. And what I really like about it is that it has this good flow diagram overview and these strong colors that make you recognize the nodes very well. So I really like the user interface. But I can't really say a lot about the tool because I was not able to test it myself. I was on a call with the company that develops Celtx, and I think they were a bit suspicious because I work for Articy now. But they did demonstrate and show me the tool, so that's all I can say about it. What I especially like about Celtx is that you have this split screen view where you can, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, write your script in a screenwriting format, and on the right-hand side, you have the flow-based nodes. So you have this interactive storytelling tool, and you can also make the nodes as complex as you want to with nested nodes. And yeah, that's great. I think that's really what I like the most about Celtx. So on the pro side, like I just mentioned, the nice and tidy interface with the good flow overview. Then we have the classic screenwriting editor also in there. There is an asset library, which means you can create character templates, for example, or items, which will then in the script be automatically replaced if you edit them in the library, a bit like prefabs in Unity. Then we have JSON and CSV export that obviously I didn't test that, but they told me that you can export it in that way. So that's good. You can also create shareable playable scripts to iterate and to show them to your team. And we have customizable conditions and variables, which is also something that I can't really vouch for because I haven't used it myself, but I was told that these can be created. But another thing that they told me is that the flow itself is static. So that means there's no actual game logic inside the flow. I'm not sure how exactly in detail this works, but that means that you have to basically write your own thing that interprets whatever you put in the flow, like say if-else conditions or true or false conditions, you put them in the flow, you have to take care that Unity understands what this condition means. So that is something that you have to create yourself. Also, Celtx is originally, like I mentioned, a writing tool. And as to my knowledge, it has not been tested a lot for games. So I was not able to find any well-known games that worked with Celtx. And the pricing is subscription-based. So that means it starts from $13.50 per month. And as far as I know, you can't get a one-off license. Moving on to Ink or Inky. So this is created by Inky, who are the developers that made 80 Days and Heaven's Vault. It was also used by games that are not Inky developed. So Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a game by an American team, and they also worked with Ink and Inky. So these are games that all tested this tool, and also Inky is a very established studio. This is the Inky editor. What you have to keep in mind about Ink is that it is basically a markup language, and this is the editor that interprets this language. So it comes from a bit of a different angle compared to, let's say, a Unity plugin or a standalone or middleware software tool. Here you can see that on the left side, you create your writing content as well as the game logic. So these little asterisks are choices. And on the right side, you have the game content presented in a way that the player might see it. So the static content is once upon a time, and then you have these two choices that the player can choose from. So the upsides for Ink are that it is simple and comprehensive. You can do very fast prototyping and including shareable web stories that can be made pretty quickly. They even have an interactive story example on their website. It is free and open source, and there's also a free Unity integration tool. And obviously, as I mentioned, they tested it on their own games. They are super word heavy, so it seems that they figured all of that out. There is a separate editor available for web, and there's a JSON export. The cons are there's no state machine in that way, no flow diagram. There are, to my knowledge, no further features such as asset libraries or templates. and it might be a bit confusing and overwhelming if you have a lot of writing content. But like I said, Inky themselves have used it for very text-heavy games, so I would guess either they're pretty smart or they figured out a way to make it a bit less confusing in that way. Moving on to Articy Draft. So as I mentioned, we used Articy Draft on Orwell. Another game that used this software is Suzerain, which was also published by the same publisher that we worked with, Fellow Traveler from Melbourne. And it was also used by Disco Elysium, which is a very successful, very narrative-heavy and text-heavy game. This is an example of how Orwell works. So we have the profiler on the left side that the player uses to gather information about suspects. And this is also the information that the player basically reveals to the government. On the right side, we have where the player finds this information. In this case, we have a social media profile, and we have these little text snippets that we call data chunks that the player can literally drag and drop into the profiler. So this is the basic game loop. The player drags and drops, and then the game progresses. And depending on what the player puts into the profiler, new documents can be unlocked as well. This is an example of a flow in Orwell. This might look a little bit intimidating because it is a very large flow, but yeah, in the end, it's a very good overview on how the game works, and we were actually able to use it for narrative design. So just our game designer Daniel sort of sketching out the narrative or the mechanics of how the states work in the different chapters of the game, and then also using this as an implementation tool that is imported into the engine for the content. So this is an example of some of the writing content. We used Articy's document feature for this. This is a dating profile of one person in the game. And you can see here we are using this self-created markup language in order to identify snippets that are used as data chunks. For example, we have her date of birth here. It's October 1985, or month of birth. And this is then interpreted by the engine as a data chunk that is drag and droppable in the game. This is zooming in on some of the flow states. So the brown things that you see here are data chunks. And then we have, for example, bookmarks. That's like this light yellowish green thing. That just means that a new website is unlocked. But we used Articy Draft actually in a way that it's not quite meant for. So usually what you do is you use these transitions as the game logic and you use the nodes as the game content. But what we did was we basically use the nodes for the game logic as well. So let's say you have a true or false condition, you would usually use these little transitions or knobs to basically ask, is this true or false? Is this node true or false at this state of the game? And then depending on that, the state machine would take a different path. But in our case, we just have, for example, here, these two data chunks that are in the second column are both unlocked at the same time. And then you need both of these data chunks. The player needs to pull both of these data chunks into the profiler in order to go to the next game state. So for each column, all of these game states happen at once, and they're not a choice. And the reason why we did this is so that we could use the documents in Articy as the text editor, basically, and could put all of our text into these nodes without having any difficulty with that. So here's an example of the markup language that we used. Here, this data chunk is marked as a data chunk and has an ID. And so inside of the text, we have further information in order to identify this and to link it basically to the nodes. So our text is separate from the nodes. Unless it's dialogue, then we use the nodes because it is a bit more convenient if you have shorter dialogue inside the nodes. So the pros for Articy Draft, as I mentioned, you can have pretty complex state machines, including nested nodes. Linear writing is more convenient if you use this document feature like we did. On Orwell, we were able to do, as I mentioned, narrative design and writing inside of Articy Draft, or our game designer was actually able to sort of sketch out the level design and then also implement the logic in the same tool, which was very cool. Then the export function lets you choose very specifically what you want to export. So for Orwell, for example, we were able to export, let's say, websites separately from phone call dialogues or messenger dialogues. And this means if you mess up some of this content, which you will do 100 million times, and have to re-import it, you can choose what exactly to re-import depending on whatever you messed up. So this is a bit of a disadvantage as well. When not working in the engine with a separate software tool, you have to just take this extra step of importing it before you can test it properly. Yeah, so it is good for text-heavy games, like Orwell is a text-heavy game, and we use it for that. Then you have debugging functions like making IDs mandatory, so Articy will fuss at you if you forget to put in an ID. In our case, we had these data chunks that had mandatory IDs so that we could figure out which data chunk it is. And then we have a very solid localization workflow, which it works in a way that also via Excel sheets, which you can import into Unity, and they actually have a free Unity importer, so you don't have to write that yourself either. The cons are that the flows themselves, the flow fragments they are called in Articy. So for Orwell, we did not use that for our long form text. We had these separate documents, which is one of the reasons why we use it in a bit of a weird way, because it was more convenient to write these long documents separately. But if you have just sort of choice-based dialogue, you can still use the flow nodes conveniently. Then collaboration is only possible by dividing the project into partitions. So say you have several writers working on one project, you have to occupy or free these partitions depending on who is working on what. So you just have to talk to each other, and then you don't have live collaboration like you have in Google Docs or something like that. Then the state machine is not visible inside of the engine. This was actually something that my teammates at the time were criticizing a bit because it's a bit more difficult to find out which state exactly causes the game to break or the error to happen if you can't see, like I showed you in PlayMaker earlier, which state the engine is in at which time. Larger and more complicated flows might cause performance issues, which can be mitigated though if you use the nested nodes a bit more. And then the price point is starting at 85 euros, which is around 136 Australian dollars for a one-off license. And then we have the subscription-based model for 6 euros or 10 Australian dollars per month, which is actually still, like compared to the other tools, it is probably one of the more expensive ones, but it's still a fair price. Yeah, and then we have Yarn or Yarn Spinner. This was used for Night in the Woods, and in the same with Ink or Inkle. So Yarn is the language basically, and Yarn Spinner is the editor that uses this language. This is an example of the flow-based nodes that you can use in Yarn. And I actually sort of sketched out the dialogue that I showed you earlier for the mom word fight scene in Yarn Spinner originally, just to see how this tool works and how I can work with it. So this is an example of that. And this is inside one of the nodes. So we have mom here saying, why didn't you tell me where you're going to Blueberry? And then we have the two player choices for dialogue saying, since when do you care? Or I'm fine, as you can see. And depending on which dialogue the player chooses, either mom gets no additional blues or plus 10 blues. So this is also something that you can integrate into the dialogue directly using Yarn. And so this is pretty convenient. It's not as intuitive as it is in PlayMaker, but it does work pretty well. And you also have the advantage that you can write a lot of text inside of these nodes. So I would say the pros are it is open source and free. So Yarn is based on Twine, and Twine is maybe something that you already know. The reason why I didn't give Twine an extra category is because Yarn Spinner is kind of an evolution of Twine, and yeah, it has a pretty good editor. It is simple and easy to use for basic choice-based dialogue systems. It is possible, sorry, to change global game variables using markup in the text, like I just showed you with the blues in Blueberry. And it is also developed by a very friendly team from Tasmania called the Secret Lab. So this is actually also an upside. The developers are pretty approachable. They have a Discord community that you can join and ask questions or contribute to the software. So this openness is very advantageous. The cons are the nodes and the long-form text cannot be accessed simultaneously. So, for example, like I showed you in Celtx, which obviously has other downsides as well, but this would just be sort of the ideal use case if you could do that. Then we don't have further features such as component libraries or templates in the same way as, for example, yeah, also Celtx does it with the characters, and where you have a sort of prefab, if you like, that you can change in order to change, for example, the names or item descriptions or whatever. And then so far it's only meant for Unity. I don't know if that's something that will change in the future. So it is written in C#, and there is Unity integration built into it, but as far as I know, for no other engines. Yeah, and then I would also like to mention a few honorable mentions. So as I said, I think like each of these tools has its strengths and weaknesses, but it is totally like totally depends on what kind of game you're making or what your goals are, at which stage you are with your game. So I think that it might be worth looking into some others, which I couldn't describe in as much depth as I have the tools that I just went through. So we have Campfire as the first tool. This is a web-based narrative design tool. I think also originally meant for screenwriters, but it's a really neat way of organizing your stories, including story beats, relationships, location. It's a very friendly looking tool, and it's nice. For example, it might be really cool to use as a wiki for the whole team to look up character relationships or the story itself and use it as a template, or let's say for an artist who wants to visually design a character, they might be able to find out more about this character inside of this tool. So that's pretty cool. Then I recently learned about Novella by Mike Blackney, who is the developer behind Dead Static Drive from Melbourne. And he recently gave a talk at DevCom, which is the conference just before Gamescom. And he's using Unreal Engine for Dead Static Drive and creating his own tool to use for the game, for the narrative of the game. And Dead Static Drive is a sort of open world style game. So this means the logic can be a bit more complex in some ways, like the NPC behavior might depend on whatever the player did earlier in the game. And then we have things like situations where a character can be a companion of the player and then stay with the player for a while. And depending on other incidences inside the game that happen at the same time, the companion might leave or might go back home, or yeah, so these things happen simultaneously in the game. And it sounded really interesting how Mike was developing this tool. And it's also because I was talking a lot about Unity so far, because that's the engine that I usually use. And for Unreal, if you're using that, I think it also works with blueprints in Unreal. Then you might want to keep an eye on that, because Mike also said that after releasing Dead Static Drive, he would want to make it open source and free as well. So this is definitely really, really cool. And then we have Writer Duet, which this is a pretty basic text editor, which is browser-based, but this is also something from the screenwriting film industry, and it's really nice, intuitive, also has a free version, and if you want to format your game writing or your design script in a way that uses film writing standards as a template, this is a really good way to get started on that. So yeah, in conclusion, accessibility definitely matters. Excuse me. So pricing is one of those factors, especially if you are a small studio. You might not have the budget to afford another subscription next to your Unity, maybe your Adobe license, or whatever 3D programs you are using to subscribe to another software. So if you have something that is one-off and not super high price, then this is definitely something to consider. Then intuitive usage and comfort for creative writing also matters. You don't want your tools to get in the way of your creativity, because like if you have a super sophisticated tool, but you can't really work with it because it gets in the way of your creative process, that doesn't really matter, because your game is going to suck anyway. even if it works well, it might not be so cool creatively. Yeah, and it's okay to have a really messy creative process. It's totally fine to use several tools depending on where your game is at in the development cycle. Then I would also recommend to think about text editing features as being just as important as game logic features. So for example, the search and replace function that I mentioned, that is something that's not only convenience, but it's actually, it can save you a significant amount of work. And then engine integration is very useful for debugging. So if you want to find out where in your implementation of the narrative design logic your errors are, then you are going to be very thankful to have debugging. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I hope that it gave you a good idea of what is out there and what you would like to use for your game. If you have any further questions, either drop them in the chat now, or you can hit me up on Twitter. My handle is @mel__t, or by email on mel@mellowgames.com. Yeah, thank you very much. And have a lovely GCAP.